And now I'd like to introduce our Al-Anon spiritual keynote speaker, Jim M. from Columbus, Georgia. Thank you.
My name is Jim Miller. I'm a grateful recovering Al-Anon. I've been introduced all this time as a spiritual speaker. I guess that my goal in life would be to be a humorous speaker, and so I always like Alcoholics Anonymous is noted for its humor, perhaps more than we Al-Anons are. And in my home group, we used to meet where we could hear the AAs at times, not hear murmurs or laughter, or they could hear us. And it seems like several times throughout their meetings, the AAs would there'd be this laughter that would roll through their rooms, and that didn't seem to happen in my home group. My meeting quite as much as in their meeting. But when it did happen in our meeting, there were a lot of nervous alcoholics when we left our meeting. Because each and every one of them thought we were laughing at them. So I like to tell a couple of Al-Anon jokes, beforehand. So get things started. And one of my favorites is about you've heard the jokes about screwing in and out of light bulbs. How many psychiatrists does it take to screw in a light bulb? Or only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. But you know how many Al-Anons it takes to change a light bulb? It says none. An Al-Anon just sits back, detaches, and tells the light bulb to screw itself. But my favorite Al-Anon joke, perhaps, is you can always tell an Al-Anon when they're about to die, because someone else's life flashes before their very eyes. I do want to step back for a moment, and I want to thank the committee for inviting me to come this weekend to Connecticut. It's just been wonderful. I was excited about the snow. I know no one else was, but coming from Georgia, I've never seen 6 inches of snow, and they were saying it might be 6 inches of snow here, so I was excited about that. The weather was beautiful, and so it's reminded me that the spring will come here just as it has in Georgia. My azaleas are in bloom. Our daffodils have almost gone by, and so it's beautiful down there, and spring's going to come here also. So it's been a beautiful day yesterday afternoon. But it's been wonderful. Met some wonderful people. Want to thank the two Terrys. Want to thank Don for meeting us at the airport and just being so hospitable. Tony and just everyone on the committee. It's just really been wonderful. Warm Connecticut hospitality. So it's been great. I do have to say after that though that I have had one problem this weekend, and that usually, whenever I'm with a group of Al-Anons, I find myself being very, very identified. Like I feel a part of. I feel like I identify. I feel like, people have the same problems that I do, but that they're the same as I've been. And to tell you the truth, I've known Juanita, for a long time, and who spoke last night, and our other keynote speaker, Maggie, I ate dinner with her Friday night, and they really are lovely ladies. They really are lovely ladies. But somehow, as they got up here and spoke, I had a hard time identifying. They're both Irish, and I'm of Scotch background. My mother was a MacRae. They're both Catholic, and my family's been Protestant forever. I grew up Methodist. In fact, I can remember in this little town in Georgia when I grew up, I can remember when the first Catholic family moved to Manchester. And despite the fact that I am listed as a spiritual speaker, unlike both of them, I have never even considered becoming a nun. But except for that, I identified with all of their story. I was born in a small town in Georgia, and I grew up in an alcoholic home. My father was a professional man. He was a dentist, and in this small town. And he was kind of a gentle drunk. He came home early in his alcoholism, got drunk, went to sleep, and that was it. Later on in his alcoholism, he began to drink at work and get drunk at work. and then come home. He was never abusive, but he was emotionally absent. And everyone in this town knew that my father was an alcoholic. I believe today. I believe that was true then. I don't think that's a false distortion. Everyone knew. In fact, in this little town, I was told by people and the receptionists, I knew that when people came in to see my father, they would ask the receptionist, "Can Dr. Miller see me today?" And they didn't mean, "Is there an appointment open on the schedule?" And if my father was too drunk, the receptionist would just say, "No, Dr. Miller can't see you today." And if he was sober, they would let the patient see my father. My father eventually got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous in 1969. In fact, he'd gone to a place where a doctor was sobering up people in his home in 1969, and Dr. John Mooney in Statesboro, Georgia. And he stayed there in Dr. John Mooney's home and lived there. He was detoxed there, lived there in Dr. John Mooney's home with his family for several months, and came back on the day that I graduated from high school, valedictorian of my class. And I was talking with someone about small classes. It was Diana last night, and there were 79 in my high school class, so being number one was not such a big deal. But he wanted to come back and see me graduate from high school, and left probably a little bit before Dr. Mooney really wanted him to. And he was sober 5 years when he died in a car accident. And I'm very grateful for that time together. I learned about Alcoholics Anonymous. I learned about what AA did for him, and I saw what Alcoholics Anonymous was like, and I saw what Al-Anon was like, because I was introduced to a lot of people in AA and Al-Anon. My father, after about a year of sobriety, married a woman who had 13 years of sobriety in AA, Lillian Arnold. She became Lillian Miller when she married my father. And she was a lovely lady. We called her our other mother. I was 20 when they got married. We didn't call her our stepmother. She was our other mother. And she was a wonderful, wonderful woman, a beautiful grandmother to my children. And eventually it became my wife's sponsor when she needed the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm very grateful for my father's alcoholism because I learned what AA was like. If it was not for Alcoholics Anonymous, Lillian would never have been a part of my life, and she was a great, great treasure in my life. I graduated from high school. My father was sober. I went off to Duke University in North Carolina, and there I met my wife, and we eventually got married. During this time, I should back up just a moment because I want to say something about my father's alcoholism and something that meant to me. Because you see, although I understood Alcoholics, I read the Big Book of AA. He gave it to me, and I read a lot, so I read the Big Book of AA, and so I had some appreciation of it. But I had no idea that this had anything to say about me. Anything to say about me. And in looking back, I should, had I been as smart as I thought I was, I would have realized that it had a lot to say about me. Because when I look back at that young man that I was growing up in that alcoholic home, I'm not real pleased with what I see. And I remember when before my father's alcoholism progressed too greatly, before my parents were divorced, I remember when I was about 12 years old, my father announced that he was going to buy a new car. And he was going to buy a new Ford. And this was the first year that the Ford Galaxy LTD came out. The Galaxy had been the top of the line of the Ford line for quite some time, but they were coming out with the LTD, top of the line Ford. And there was a massive promotional campaign throughout the United States, and it was on all the TV programs. And the Ford Galaxy LTD was going to be quieter than a Rolls Royce. They had things that measured sound inside the car. I remember the advertisements, It was quieter than a Rolls Royce, and we were going to get a new car, and we were going to get a Ford Galaxy LTD, I knew. And I knew that I was the kind of person who deserved to ride around in a car like that, 12 years old. And my father came home in a regular Ford Galaxy, not the LTD. And I was pissed. Now, I don't know why I had decided somehow that life owed me something, that I deserved something like the LTD, that somehow I was better than other people and it was okay for them to ride around in a Ford Galaxy, but I deserved the LTD. But that's that attitude of that young man. You know, today the very last thing that I would ever pray for is, God, please give me what I deserve. So much would be taken away. So much would be taken away. Yeah. So I look back at that man. When my father got sober, he came out one night and he said, Jim, he'd been sober a couple of years, and it was a July night in Georgia, and it was hot. And the stars were bright, and he was living in this little apartment at that point and on the edge of town, and there weren't many lights out. And I remember looking up at the sky that night because he had asked me to go outside with him, and there were more stars in the sky than there have ever been in any night before or after in my life. And we sat on the car in his little driveway. And he said, Jim, do you remember a letter that you wrote to me while I was at Dr. John's? And I did, because it had been a very hard letter to write. And in that letter I had written, Dad, I love you because any son would and should love their father. And I was doing things that I should do. But I have no respect for you. And 2 years sober, my father said, Jim, have I earned your respect? And I said, of course, Dad, of course you've earned my respect. Haven't you seen that in the way I treat you and what I say, what I believe? And he says, yes, Jim. He says, you have shown me, but I want to hear the words. I want to hear the words. And I said, sure, Dad, I respect you. And he said, good, because I have that letter in my top drawer, and I'd like to tear it up and throw it away. And I learned a lesson there at that time. Because see, what I learned was that words are important. Your actions are important, but words are important too. You know, and I can't do just both. I can't act just as if. I need to say the words too. And I can't just talk the talk. I need to walk the walk. And I'm very grateful that my father was able to ask for what he needed at that time. And I'm glad that I was willing to give it to him. I believe that what we were doing was really a ninth step to each other, although I don't remember his using those words. And but afterward, I know that's what we were doing to each other, with each other. Now, after being in Al-Anon for a while, I look back on that with a little bit of difference. Because you see, what I had confused was respect and admiration. I did not admire my father's alcoholism. I did not admire the things that alcoholism had done to him. I did not admire what he had become in his alcoholism. I did not admire that. But today I believe and I hope that despite that I would be able to respect my father. Because you see, I believe that every human being in this world deserves my respect simply because they are a fellow child of God. A fellow child of God. No better, no worse than I, but a fellow child of God. Because you see, I spent a lot of my life, and still do at times, having problems in comparing and contrasting myself. You know, I heard it best described by someone many years ago, and it just describes it perfectly. He said, I'm on a pulley. On a pulley. And I'm either better than you, or I'm worse than you. And when I'm thinking a lot about myself, it pulls you down. And when I'm thinking badly about myself, it puts you up there. And both are dangerous to my spiritual health. And what recovery, a large part for me, has been cutting the strings of that pulley. So that I am who I am, just a fellow child of God. And you are who you are, a fellow child of God. And you're my brothers, and you're my sisters. And when I remember that, I'm in a pretty good place. And when I forget that, I can go back to sometimes being that young man that I don't have a lot of, not very proud of being. So when I look at my father today, if the similar circumstances think, yeah, I don't admire what you're doing and some things have hurt me, but I think I would be able to respect him just because he was a fellow child of God. I'm going to go back to Duke University now and meeting my wife and marrying her, having jumped back to my childhood. But Christy and I had a great time. We were social drinkers. It seemed appropriate at the time. And we went to fraternity parties and we drank and no problem. And we did this and that and partying and it was fun and we studied hard. And we had a great time and we got married. I went off to Augusta, Georgia to go to the Medical College of Georgia and was in medical school. And we continued this, studying hard, drinking, no problem. And we thought we had the perfect marriage. Just the perfect marriage. You know, we were the perfect couple. We were going to have the perfect friends. Everything was just wonderful and marvelous. Yeah. And we thought that was the way it was going to be. You know, and when I look at Christy at this point, I realize that at this point, Christy was my God. I had put Christy up on a pedestal, and I thought that she was going to make me happy. And it was my job to make her happy, and the two of us could conquer the world. There's a page in our ODAT that talks about loving the image rather than the person. And in some ways I realized at this point that what I was doing was I was worshiping or loving this image of Christy. Not who she was, but who I thought she was, who I wanted her to be. I remember one time, this time in our marriage, early on in the marriage, Christy told me, she said, "Jim, I'm really a very shy person." I said, "No, you aren't." And she said, "No, I tell you, I know I hide it well, but I'm really a shy person." I said, "No, you aren't." And she said, "Jim, I'm really telling you I'm a shy person." And I said, "No, you aren't. I wouldn't have married a shy person." Yeah. Loving the image rather than the person. Wanting her to be someone that I saw her. Not being able to see, not being able to listen to her, and for her trying to tell me who she really is. I graduated from medical school and went off to Dallas, Texas, and spent 3 years there doing my internship and residency in internal medicine at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. This was okay. I mean, it was a tough life. It was a hard life. But Christy and I talked about it. It was one of the tougher internships and residencies in the country. And, I'd be at the hospital for 36 hours, home for 12 hours, at the hospital for 12 hours, home for 12 hours, and then at the hospital 36 hours again. And pretty much went on that 12 months a year. My contract with Parkland Memorial Hospital said that I worked for them 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, period. Now, we did have 2 weeks of vacation promised us. Well, we knew that we could expect 2 weeks of vacation, but it was not promised us in the contract. If everything worked out okay and they didn't need us, we got 2 weeks of vacation. All right? And they were going to pay me $11,000 a year for this. All right. But that's okay. And, that meant that I wasn't going to have much time for Christy. We found out she was pregnant with our first child. But that was okay. Because, you see, we had the perfect marriage. I was going to spend about 3 years at the hospital, coming home every once in a while. And then after that 3 years, we were going to just go get back together and enjoy the rest of our life because we had the perfect marriage. You see, and when something is perfect, you don't have to work on it. Yeah, no problem. After being in Dallas 2 years and after our daughter was about a year old, I walked into a darkened apartment one night after leaving the hospital. My daughter asleep in her bedroom. My wife curled up in bed in our apartment with not a light on in the apartment, and she was sobbing, and I knew something horrible had happened. I felt like perhaps maybe her parents had died in a plane crash. Something horrible had happened. And she told me the story of her drug addiction. That she'd begun to take prescription drugs, painkillers, Percodan. And she's taking 36 Percodan every day. And when Christy tells her story, she says she thinks it's because I understood addiction and that I understood recovery through my father's recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous. I just think that I was dumb. and didn't understand really what was going on. But I know that I loved her, and I know that I took her in my arms, and I hugged her, and I said, "Sweetheart, everything's going to be okay." Because Christy had decided that when she told me that I would divorce her. Because she was using my name and my narcotics number in order to get that Percodan. But I got her in my arms, and I said, "Everything's going to be okay." And the next morning, I went out to make sure that it was. And I went to the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, which was associated with Parkland Memorial Hospital. I went to the chairman of the department and I said, "I want the best psychiatrist in addiction medicine in the city of Dallas, Texas." And he gave me the name, and I made her an appointment, and I had taken care of that problem, and I was ready to go on to the next. No problem. We were going to live happily ever after. Everything was fixed. I'd made the appointment. She was going to go. She was smart. He was smart. They'd figure it out. After a while, and there was no more Percodan. I didn't know, and Christy wasn't telling me once she stopped using the Percodan, that she'd begun to drink. Now, we were drinking occasionally at times, because at this time, really, that kind of heavy social drinking had calmed down, because times were no longer appropriate, and we'd have a drink every once in a while. But, she wasn't telling me she was drinking by herself. She called my stepmother, Lillian. My father was dead several years before, but Lillian was there, and so Christy called Lillian to tell, because she just had to reach out to somebody other than me, and she had no other friends in Dallas. And she called Lillian from Dallas and said, "Lillian, I need you." One night, and Lillian was there by noon the next day. I'd flown by noon the next day. Now, later on, Lillian told us that Christy didn't tell Lillian why she needed her. And Lillian admitted that later on she said, "What has that boy done to her?" This is my stepmother, my other mother. But Christy shared her drug addiction with Lillian, and Lillian smiled and said, "Well, we can go to a meeting." And Christy said, "What kind of meeting?" And she said, "A meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous." And so, as I said, I was into doing what I was told, and she told Christy she was going to AA, and they'd go to a meeting together, and she told me I should go to Al-Anon, and so I went to my first Al-Anon meeting in Dallas, Texas. Now, I don't know, this is my story. I'm here to share my experience, strength, and hope, and how it happened with me. Okay, that's all I have to share. I went to that first meeting, and they said, "Oh, so your wife has a drinking problem?" I said, No, I don't mind if she drinks at all. It's just these drugs that I have a problem with. And I'm real glad that nobody said, "Well, there's some other place you can go," or "We don't like your kind here," or "We don't have any help for you." What they did is they patted me on the back and said, "Keep coming back." And I did. I kept coming back. Now, I'm smart. I know the rules. Even though I understood that, drugs and alcohol are very similar in addiction and alcoholism, so I didn't go up in the meetings and say, "I don't have any problem if my wife drinks," or, talk about that in the meetings. I might say that to, somebody after the meeting, but in the meetings, I got the lingo right, and I called her an alcoholic, even though I really knew she was just an addict, and all this, and I began to apply some of those things. I wasn't disruptive at the meetings, okay? And they let me come and kept patting me on the back and say, "Keep coming back." That was in April of 1979. 17 years ago next month will be my birthday in Al-Anon. In July, we'd been going to meetings, and we were still drinking occasionally. But Christy, as far as I knew, was drug-free, and I thought things were going reasonably well. And we came back east, as I learned to call anything back this way. We didn't go back south. We came back east from Texas. And we were making a little tour around for places for me to set up practice when I got out of my residency program. And we came to Charlotte, North Carolina. My wife, Christy, had a brother lived in Charlotte. And we came there to visit. The first night, Christy's brother was not home. He was out on business and was not home, so we were there at his house by ourselves. And a strange thing began to occur. Christy began to act strangely. Her gait seemed wobbly, as if her balance was not quite good. Her speech became mildly garbled, as if she could not enunciate correctly. some of her thought processes seemed to be confused, and she didn't make sense all the time. And I became concerned. Because you see, I had had 4 years of college at a prestigious university, 4 years of medical school, and had just completed 2 years of a very fine specialty training program in internal medicine. And I began to immediately think that she had either had a transient ischemic attack, an impending stroke, or acute Alzheimer's disease. I carefully noted all the symptoms that I was observing, placed them in my mind because I had said, well, whatever's going to happen, I'm going to have to report this back, and my plan was to go to the chairman of the Department of Neurology at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School and find out what was going on. I always went to the chairman of the department, never anyone else. Went to sleep quite worried, not wanting to embarrass my wife, never mentioning to her the fact that I thought her behavior was strange. Don't talk rule. And woke up the next morning pleased to find that the syndrome of the night before had disappeared. And no problems during the day that day. That night her brother came home, and we were, I think, grilling steaks out, and he said, well, would you like to have a couple of drinks before dinner? And Christy said sure, and I said sure, and he said sure. And after a couple of drinks, or 3 or 4, the behavior of the night before returned. You see, but the night before, we weren't drinking. And it had never occurred to me that Christy was drinking behind my back. There was no reason for it in my mind. I didn't mind if she drank. So it never occurred to me the night before that was because of alcohol, because we weren't drinking. And that night I knew that alcohol was a problem. I knew that those people in Al-Anon were right when they said, keep coming back. I continued to go to Al-Anon meetings at this time. I'd been going all along, and I began to go, with new fervor, and new things. Now, we have a problem here. Okay, we have a problem here because you see, I started going to Al-Anon after Christy had stopped using the pills. And I started going to Al-Anon before I was concerned about her drinking. So, I would go to meetings and I would laugh with y'all about all those things that you used to do, and then I'd go home and do them. I never hunted for a bottle at home until I started coming to Al-Anon. I had never given Christy the Al-Anon kiss, before I started coming to Al-Anon. So I'd sit there and laugh like y'all are about all these things, and then I'd go home and do them. Yeah. I remember our daughter one time was driving. I was talking to my mother on our phone, and I was in the bedroom, and Christy was on the phone in the kitchen in this little apartment that we had. And my daughter found one of Christy's bottles. It was a half gallon of Old Granddad, and she was dragging it behind her. This little toddler, just like a little toy. She had no idea what it was. It was like a little toy, and we were on the phone with her, and I said. I just kind of put my hand on the phone and I said, go show your mother. She's just happy. She just drags it back. And Christy's talking on the phone to my mother. I knew exactly the minute that my daughter went into the room. I was a champion bottle hunter. See, we had this problem because Christy kept going to AA meetings and she kept picking up white chips. She would pick up white chips, she would stop drinking, or say she'd stopped drinking, whenever it is, So whenever I found a bottle and caught it, she'd go get a white chip. All right, and so when I found a bottle, sometimes though, I'd go in, I'd be hunting for bottles, and I'd find a bottle, and I'd say, "Here it is," and she'd say, "Jim, I have already quit drinking from that bottle. That's an old bottle. I've already picked up a white chip for that one." So what I had to do, now, and my choice of a verb here is intentional and precise. I felt I had to do. I found the bottle that had some in it. Now, that was difficult. Okay? I would carefully find out where on the bottle it was, place it back where it was, and go back 2 hours, 4 hours, or 8 hours later, bring out the bottle, and then I could prove that she had been drinking in the last 2, 4, or 8 hours, and that she had not picked up a white chip for that. And sure enough, I had control, because if that happened, and I went to the open meeting with her, she would pick up another white chip. But it did nothing about the drinking. Nothing for the drinking. We went to a meeting there in Dallas called the Family Afterward Meeting. We eventually started one in Columbus, and it's a mixed AA, open AA, and Al-Anon meeting. It can't be a group, but it's a meeting called the Family Afterward, named after the chapter in the Big Book, and it's aimed at couples living in recovery. But open meeting, anyone can come, and love this meeting. Because like a lot of us, I like the alcoholics better than the Al-Anons at first. I just have to be, honest about that. I love alcoholics. I can't help it. It's just marvelous. And like if I just meet anyone out on the street, they turn out to be, I think probably an alcoholic or married to one, and so anybody I like, that's it. But we went to this meeting, and one night the subject was humor, and I started out with a couple of jokes, and so humor's kind of interesting, and the subject was humor in the program. And it really is strange. I noticed it with Juanita, last night. Is her stories. People get up here when they're the alcoholic or the Al-Anon and sit up here and we tell the stories about how bad it used to be, and we just laugh and laugh and laugh. And then at the end of the story, we get to how good it is today, and we cry and cry and cry. Well, we were talking about humor in the program. This is one of the things that were brought up, and it got my turn to share. And I had been thinking, as everyone else was talking, about what I wanted to say, all the way around the room. And I had decided that I was really pleased with the little brief speech I had made up. And I talked about the difference between tragedy and comedy in the ancient Greeks, particularly with some reference to the plays of Euripides, and really a wonderful, quite enlightening, short, concise little talk. And afterward, a woman came up to me who'd been in Al-Anon a long, long time, and she said, "Jim, we are here to share our experience, strength, and hope, not our education. And if you don't have any experience, strength, and hope, don't say anything." I still have a resentment against that woman. She is absolutely right. She's absolutely right. I'm very glad that that by that time I was hooked on Al-Anon, or I might have been driven away, but you couldn't have driven me away. She's absolutely right. Share my experience, strength, and hope. See, and that's my prayer, and that's my goal, and that's what I want to do when I share, whether or not it's here, or whether or not it's in my home group, or whether or not it's in a discussion meeting, is to share me with you. Because you see, that's really the only gift I have. That's the only gift that I have of me, is to share me with you. Now, God's given me many other transient gifts. He's given me He's given me intelligence. He's given me a career. He's given me a vocation. He's given me a beautiful, wonderful, recovering wife. He's given me 3 beautiful daughters. He's given me an emotionally adopted son that I never had. He's given me all these wonderful gifts. He's given me more than my share of material blessings, material gifts. But really, the only gift I have to share with you is me. That's the best gift I have. Now, I'm amazed sometimes when I get up and share before a huge group like this. I'll tell y'all things about me that 17 years ago I wouldn't have told my best friend. Yeah. Incredible. Incredible. And so when I remember that that's the gift that I have to give, my experience, my strength, my hope, to share me with you, and that's always my prayer before I give a talk like this. I'm back in Dallas now. Back there in going to those Al-Anon meetings, Christy's not getting sober. Mine not really knowing when she's drinking, when she's not, because Christy had a high tolerance. And what Christy do is drink a little bit all day long. She'd drink a quart of vodka every day, but she'd drink it essentially 24 hours a day, so just a little bit all day long, never getting really drunk. And I didn't know most of the time when she was drinking or when she wasn't drinking. I couldn't tell, except that's why I had to find those bottles, because somehow I felt like if I knew, I could do something. We moved to Columbus, Georgia, there to set up my practice. And Columbus is about 30 miles from that little town that I grew up in, and I had two brothers there. And we got to Columbus, and immediately as soon as we got to Columbus, I started in going to Al-Anon and been regular there in the same home group since 1980. And Christy got sober. Yeah. I didn't do anything special. I didn't cause anything to happen, but Christy got sober. And life was good. And life was wonderful. And Lillian, my stepmother, who'd been in AA forever. She'd been the secretary of the Georgia State Assembly. She was the first secretary of the Georgia State Assembly, and she had that essentially until she was so sick that she couldn't have it anymore. I think she served for 13 years. And Lillian knew everybody in Georgia, in Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon, and she knew most everybody in the Southeast. And my expectation is even in Connecticut, somebody's going to come up and going to say, "Yeah, I met Lillian at some convention someplace." I won't be at all surprised, even though she's been dead for 10 years now. But Lillian came in and she introduced Christy and me to everybody in AA. We went to conventions and we went everywhere, and it was just wonderful and it was marvelous. And Christy and I were doing all these things together, and I was active in Al-Anon. We were asked to share it at some gatherings, and that was a wonderful experience. And after about 3 years of this wonderful recovery, I began to get sick again. Because I began to suspect, to fear, that Christy was drinking. And I wish I could tell you that I talked to my sponsor about it, but I didn't. And I wish I could tell you that I talked to my home group about it and talked about it in the meetings, but I didn't. Because you see, what if I were wrong? How could I falsely accuse her of something who was 3 years sober? Falsely accuse. Does that sound like I believe that this was a disease? A chronic, progressive, relapsing disease? No. I didn't want to accuse her of something. I couldn't talk to anybody about this. And after this went on for several months, I finally got up the courage one day to talk to Christy about it. And I confronted her with this, but I believe and I thank you, members of Al-Anon, and I thank this 12-step recovery program for, I believe, allowing me to do that in the right way. Because you see, I talked to Christy and I said, "Christy, I've been getting sick. I am afraid and I'm full of fear that you've been drinking again." And I'm sure that although I've tried to hide this, that it cannot help but to have affected me in many ways in the way that I've reacted to you. And if I have seemed distant, it's because of this fear of mine. And I'm going to plan on doing something about it, and I'm going to talk to my sponsor, and I'm going to talk to my group, and I'm going to see what I can do to help myself. And as I remember that day, I did not ask Christy if she were drinking. I did not ask her what was going on with her. I just talked about me and what was going on with me. It was not long after that Christy made a call to a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and even though she'd been continuing to go to meetings during this period of time, that she finally reached out to one of those people and admitted that she was drinking. And again, it wasn't easy for Christy. It took her 2 years to get sober again. Several hospitalizations. Now, when I say sober again, I mean continuous sobriety, because Christy has 10 years of continuous sobriety now after that time, but it took her 2 years to get continuous sobriety. But even when she wasn't drinking, she was not drinking a lot more than she was drinking during those 2 years, but a lot of it was a dry drunk. And I'm very grateful for those 2 years. Sometimes in my home group we talk about relapse. Now, I make sure that every once in a while we talk about relapse because, see, I don't remember that we talked about that in those 3 years. And so when I began to fear that Christy had relapsed, I was afraid to talk about it. And I make sure that we talk about it every once in a while now. And you know what I tell those people? People will say, people who've been in the program a long time, they'll say, I really am. I don't, Al-Anon works and Al-Anon's wonderful, but I don't know what would happen if my alcoholic were to relapse. See, I'm one of the lucky ones. I know my program works even if the alcoholic in my life is drinking. Yeah, I know it works. Yeah. Now, I've had it both ways, and I prefer it when they don't drink than when they do drink. All right? Yeah. But as it says in our closing, I'd be happy whether the alcoholic is still drinking or not. I know that can be true. And that's what I learned in this 2-year period. I began to, a guy named Sam asked me to sponsor him. Just when I had the greatest need, somebody asked me to sponsor them. And that way it always works. And I tell you, I got so much out of that relationship with Sam. Kind of one of the first real close personal friends I'd had since college days, male friends. And Christy wasn't much fun. She was drinking, and she wasn't loud, obnoxious, or rip-roaring or anything. She was just kind of doing her own little thing, not very available. And so I was having fun with my friends in Al-Anon and with Sam. I did not sit at home with her. I made a life for myself in those 2 years. And I did things with our daughters, whether or not Christy wanted to join us or not. If she wanted to join us, fine. But if not, with our 3 daughters, I would do things with them. Sam and I began to see each other a lot. We'd 2 or 3 times a week we'd have lunch. We'd play tennis once a week. During this period of time, Christy and I were having marriage counseling once a week. And I tell you, after marriage counseling every week, when with the problems that we were having, I needed somebody to debrief with afterwards. So Sam was a good person for me to debrief with. Because I was trying to work an Al-Anon program. I was disagreeing professionally with how my wife was being treated. I was having problems with that. When to detach, when to do that. Things were rough. Things were rough. But Sam and I had a great relationship, and we were seeing each other, as I said, almost every day, either for coffee after work or lunch at work or playing tennis. And all of a sudden, it occurred to me, I'm driving this guy crazy. I'm calling him every day. Yeah, I bet he is sorry he ever asked me to be a sponsor. I better stop calling him and see what happens. You know what was really happening was that what I was getting in touch with was some of that, was some low self-esteem, some of my own shame, some of that own feeling that when somebody got close enough to me, that I wasn't worthy of a friend like Sam. Yeah, I wasn't good enough. I wasn't okay. Yeah, because Sam had gotten to know me, and surely by now he didn't want to spend this much time with me. And I had enough program that at that point somebody says, Jim, you got to have the courage to talk to Sam about this. You can't just stop calling. And I did. And he said, Jim, he says, I own my own business. My schedule's free. You've got patience. You've got a schedule. Of course I wait for you to call me. That's the way it is. If you'd stopped calling me, I would have wondered what was wrong with me. Yeah. And so what that got me in touch with was really that I had a lot of that basic shame, which I believe, probably began in that alcoholic family that I grew up with. Trying to be the perfectionist, trying to prove to everybody that I was okay, trying to be the tops in my class and graduate number 1, trying to look good in everyone else's eyes, because deep down inside I felt like that I wasn't quite good enough and never would be. If Christy hadn't relapsed, I don't think that I would have ever had the time to give that relationship that it took. And it took that time for me to come to that realization. That realization, that acceptance, that awareness of that problem was a gift of Christy's relapse. Al-Anon's to give me the tools that I needed to in order to have that done. I don't think that any of that comes just because it happens, that happens, and there's a purpose in that, and my job is to find that purpose. God spoke to me during this time. Now, I don't have hallucinations, auditory nor visual, but God spoke to me. It was during this time Christy was in the hospital. She was hospitalized several times during this time, and she was in the hospital, and I had some time off. We planned on going down to see my mother in Tampa, Florida for Thanksgiving, but at the last minute when Christy was hospitalized, we decided to stay in town. And I'd already taken the time off from work, and so it was the Friday after Thanksgiving. And I had, and this was good because even though it was a regular work day, I thought, well, I've got to go down. I've got all this paperwork that's piled up on my desk, and this would be a good day to go down there and catch up on all this when I don't have any patients to see. And so I'd started down. It was a beautiful, beautiful fall day. I remember, I had this little sunroof on the car, and it was open, and there were leaves falling down on the road, and the sun was shining. Just gorgeous day. And I was heading down to the office, and I heard a voice, and it was the voice of God. And it was as if He were in the back seat of the car, and He sat there, and He said, "Jim, have fun." What a loving Father. The two voices, "Jim, have fun." And I listened. And I got home and I called Sam and I said, "Sam, let's play tennis." He said, "Well, I thought you were working today." And he said, "God doesn't want me to." When I look back at my life, and at times I can still get into this at times, when I look back at my life, one time I say that I experienced and was a sufferer of TS disease, terminal seriousness. Yeah. And God recognized that and gave me specific treatment for it. He allowed me to read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I love that it says we absolutely insist on enjoying life. Absolutely insist on enjoying life. I heard an AA speaker one time who happened to be a priest, and an Episcopal priest, and he said that he believed that when we got to heaven, wherever that was and whatever that was, and whoever met us, whether or not it was St. Peter or somebody else, whenever they brought out whatever they met us with, the first thing that they did where he wasn't going to bring out some great big book and says, "These are the things you've done right and these are the things that you've done wrong." He said, "Now, I don't know whether or not he has that book or not, but when he first gets there, I think that book's going to be closed, and he's just going to look right at each of us and say, 'Did you enjoy the wonderful life that your Creator gave you?'" Yeah, the gift of life. Do I enjoy it each and every day? Have you ever bought a gift for someone that you really were excited about? But you do, particularly like a child, you say, "Oh, this is just so wonderful. They're just going to love this, And you give it to them, and they unwrap it, and they throw it in the corner and never pay any attention to it. You ever done that? Yeah. I think of God thinking that same way with some of us. He says, "My goodness, I've given them this wonderful world, this beautiful life." Yeah. And they throw it in the corner and ignore it. I look at a tree. I look at any tree. There are thousands of them. I looked up here. I love that landscape with the kind of the bleak trees and the gray as I was walking up here because there's no sign of green in there. But even the bleak trees at that. If there were only one of those trees in the world, it would be in the middle of a parking lot with 1 million parking places around it, and everybody would come to admire it because of its beauty, because of its rare beauty. And the reason we don't do that is because there are hundreds of millions of them. Incredible. a loving God, the gift of life, the gift of this world. And at times I'll throw it into the corner. Yeah. Because I'd rather worry. I'd rather be stressed. I'd rather think about this. I'd rather worry about that. Yeah. I can make the same drive to work, on some days, and on some mornings I look around and I say, oh my goodness, particularly this time of year, the azaleas are blooming, the daffodils are coming out, the skies, it's a gorgeous day, thank you, God. The next day I can make the same drive and it's, what am I got to do today? I'm already running late. This is going to be an awful day. It's going to be a horror, stress. Christy got sober. I took her to Willingway Hospital that Dr. Al Mooney, Dr. John Mooney's son, was running at the time. She spent 3 months there. Eventually, I took her away from the hospital where she had been originally getting her treatment and no longer satisfied with their care, no longer satisfied with Christy's response to their care. And I sent her to Willingway Hospital. And as I got there, I talked with Al Mooney, Dr. Al Mooney, and he is a member of Al-Anon, and I tell this story with his permission. And we shared. And Al shared his pain because, you see, he's the only member of his family that's not alcoholic. Both of his parents were alcoholics and addicts, and both of his brothers are alcoholics and addicts, and his little sister is an alcoholic and an addict. And we shared the pain of that, and he said that the thing that was most painful to him, despite all of that, was his little sister. And that how painful it had been when he realized that she could die of her alcoholism and there was nothing that he could do to prevent that. And on the way home that night, we had a good friend who's an Alcoholics Anonymous, a friend of Christy's and mine who'd driven down there with us. And on the 4-hour drive back from Statesboro, Georgia, I cried most of the way because it was that night, after being in the program for 6 or 7 years, that I believe that I finally took the first step fully. But I was powerless over alcohol and that my life was unmanageable. Because you see, I realized that Christy could die of her alcoholism. I could put her in the hospital, but that wasn't going to mean that she wasn't going to die of her alcoholism. Yeah, and I knew other people died of their alcoholism. I'd read the obituaries. I'd been to the funerals. I had of friends in AA. I'd had patients who had died of alcoholism. I remember vividly a 19-year-old young man when I was at Parkland Hospital who died of cirrhosis of the liver from alcoholism. Despite being in the hospital and there's nothing that we could do, he was past the point of help. Yeah, but that was them. This was my wife, my alcoholic. Christy could die of alcoholism and there was nothing I could do about it. And I felt powerless and I felt pain and I cried all the way home. Yeah, there's nothing I could do. And Christy tried to take her life in that hospital and there was nothing I could do. But Christy, in her higher power, eventually made a connection. And Christy turned her will over to him, and she again became sober, and that was 10.5 years ago. And we've had another incredible journey in recovery, but it's different. I learned so much during that 2 years, and she learned so much during that 2 years. That relapse is perhaps the greatest blessing of our life. Who would have thought it? Who would have thought it? I carry around something in my book, and after my father died, Lillian gave this to me, or after I came to the program, and she'd been carrying it around. And my father had written it out in this little scrap of paper before his death, and he carried it around in his wallet. And after I got in the program, she gave it to me, and it's from a book that a man named Paul wrote to some people in Italy called the Romans about 2,000 years ago, and in that letter he says. And this is, pain produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. And hope gives us faith that will never leave us. Yeah. And so my job is to remember that when painful things in life comes, and painful things are going to come in life, painful things still come as a year. That's what gives me the character and the hope and the strength and the endurance to meet life as it is, to meet life on life's terms. So things were getting good. I'd learned, even with all that pain, I recognized that, how my experience can benefit others, and I'd recognized that I'd learned something from that. But things were getting a little too easy, and so I brought another alcoholic into my life, a 17-year-old named John. And John's is that emotionally adopted foster son, godson, whatever you want to say, that's in our family. Now, he's been living with us for the last 2.5 years. He's been sober for 7. But he came into our life and through recovery. And for a year, John was just like Christy. He picked up numerous white chips. Couldn't get sober, couldn't hang in there, but continued to come to meetings. He worked for me for a while, and I sent him out one day to buy a hammer from work. He just kind of was gophering for me and gave him the keys to my car. I needed a hammer and gave him $20 and a hammer and to go out and buy the keys to my car to go out and get this. And he'd gotten his first paycheck that time, and 3 o'clock he wasn't back. 4 o'clock he wasn't back. 5 o'clock he wasn't back. And John had stolen my car and gone to Panama City, Florida. Now, all I knew is he had stolen my car. But when you're in Georgia, we're like 4 hours from the coast, and if a 17-year-old young man steals your car, where else is he going to head but Panama City, Florida? I mean, that was just the normal place to go. I knew that's where he had to be. And he came back 3 days later. 3 days later, and I had put out a warrant for his arrest, and he was arrested. One of the hardest things I've ever done. And when I saw him in the back of that police car, because they called us, they'd caught him, and he was back in that police car in handcuffs, and he was crying uncontrollably. And Christy and I were hurting as badly as he was, but we took them to jail, and we pressed the charges, and he stayed in jail for 2 weeks. Before his parents said, tell us when you want us to post bond. And he got out. And, he learned a lesson from that. Now, the lesson that I wanted him to learn was not to drink and drug, right? Now, and he continued to drink and drug, but he never stole my car again. But John got sober, and that young man has taught me so much. And I had to go through the same kind of pain and fear and worry that I did with Sam. Like, what do I have to give to this young man? What do I have to give to this young man? What can I do to help him? And at times, of course, he wanted that help, and at times he was very rejecting of that help. And at times, leave me alone. And yet he'd call me back, or I'd call him, and we'd talk. And it's been one of the greatest gifts of my life. Because I was willing to reach out and continue to reach out and continue to struggle and figure out what I should do and what I shouldn't do. Because there were times when it would have been easier just to let go completely. And then I felt like it was God's will to keep him in my life somehow. I remember one time I was driving down through this, and I had lots of pain with this. I had lots of pain in this. But life's, program for me is not about not having pain. Program to me is living with the pain, growing through the pain, learning from the pain. But I was driving down and I was crying because something was going on with John. He was gone or he was missing or something had happened, and I was in pain. And I remember where I was on the road in my car. And all of a sudden, deep down inside of me, I got this sense that everything was going to be okay. Not that everything was going to be okay with John. Not that everything was going to be okay with our relationship. But that despite whatever happened to John and despite whatever happened in our relationship, that I was going to be okay. And that's my best definition of serenity today. It's that feeling deep down inside that says that my higher power, and as long as I have Him, that I'm going to be okay with Him. Now, that doesn't make the pain go away. That doesn't make the fear go away. That doesn't make the worry go away. But that's something in addition to all those other emotions. In fact, I think for me, emotional maturity today is having all those emotions and not trying to figure out how I need to feel. I feel all those ways. But that deep down feeling is serenity. And it is best described in this little song that I sang in that little Methodist church in Georgia as I was growing up. And the first verse of that song says, that there's there's a peace that passeth understanding down in my heart. There's a joy down in my heart, and there's a peace that passeth understanding down in my heart. Yeah, and that's what serenity is to me, a peace that passeth understanding, because despite of what's going on around me, there's a peace that I will be okay, as long as I continue to work this program and walk with the God of my understanding. Today, I try to remember that I'm a prince, a child of God, a son of God, and my God's a king, so that makes me a prince. And that makes me extremely special. But I also try to remember that each one of you is either a prince or a princess, a child of God, the son or daughter of a king, and that makes you very special. And as long as I remember that I'm extremely special, but no more special than you, then I'm where I need to be in life. And when I can remember that woman at the checkout line at the supermarket, you know, the one that is so slow, who doesn't understand how important I am, who doesn't know in what a hurry I am, when I can remember to treat her like a princess that she is, yeah, I'm doing okay. That guy that cuts in front of me on the interstate, you know, when I want to spear him with a sign of derision, but instead when I remember he's just a prince like I am, trying to get wherever he's going, you know, I'm okay. I have some of that serenity. I want to close today, as I always do, with a prayer. The prayer was written by a man named Francis, who lived in a little hilltop town in Italy called Assisi. And I've had the pleasure of visiting that town in Italy, and I'm going to have the pleasure of going back there this summer, and I'm looking very much forward to it. It's a beautiful little town. And I'd like for you to, I'm going to close with that prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of Thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. I used to think that eternal life was something that happened after death and something that I knew very little about. But today I believe that eternal life is something that I'm sitting right smack dab in the middle of, living one day at a time. Thank you.